Throughout history, during times of war, militaries all around the world have tried to gain supporters. The biggest way in which militaries did and still do try to gain supporters from its people is through the use of propaganda. The United States military alone has used propaganda from the Revolutionary War to present day. After the Revolutionary War, the World Wars were the next big reason for propaganda to be utilized. During World War I and World War II, the American people needed a sense of unity, so the United States government began to show propaganda such as the famous Uncle Sam poster or Rosie the Riveter, calling Americans and the Allies to action. These had become some of the most recognizable forms of propaganda from this time period and are still recognized today. Propaganda during this time was primarily posters. However, there were many radio stations such as the Liberty Radio in Europe, and it was also during this time that Captain America was introduced by Marvel Comics in part to draw in younger audiences into patriotism. Besides creating a sense of unity amongst the people, propaganda was also used as a source of information about the war. It informed the people about the Nazis and what they were doing and gave updates as to how the war was going. However, not all of the information was reliable. Sometimes information was changed or omitted depending on which way the government wanted to affect the emotions of the people. Another purpose for propaganda that most people didn't know about is that propaganda was used by the military to demoralize the enemy. They did this by airdropping printed flyers over the enemy that provided them with information regarding their government, as well as flyers that put Americans in the most positive light. This served two purposes, by not only demoralizing the enemy, but it also helped rally the Allied troops for battle. During World War I and World War II, new forms of propaganda began to appear. Propaganda of the radio, television, and even in theaters became very common. This was a very effective type of propaganda as it reached more people and united the Allies against the Japanese and German troops. This unity proved to be very useful. However, it blinded the American people to the other actions of our government. People were most often shown only the things that put the American and Allied troops in the best of light, and the atrocities of war were depicted as actions only undertaken by the enemy. The Cold War, which lasted from 1947 to 1991, was the war that produced the most propaganda. When this war came to form, propaganda was one of the few ways to wage a non-violent war. Thus it was used as a primary tactic in this war to win over the hearts and minds of the people to unify them. During this war, the American government's use of propaganda was primarily through the media. This includes news, movies, TV shows, and sometimes books. This was much different from the Soviets, who primarily used its military to impress their people by showing off the military's strength and power. The introduction of the television, even though it was only black and white and costed a fortune, truly revolutionized propaganda. This is because it proved a new way to speak to the people, and many of the things broadcasted over television was used to support the idea that Americans were superior, such as cowboy and Indian shows, and many commercials. During this period, the influence of the radio also increased. The radio was known in this time to be the center of most people's living rooms, and would help create family time much like the television does today. This made it easy to spread influence, and the United States worked very hard to create a perfect broadcast for this. The United States government also poured millions of dollars into reaching other countries, so radio stations like the Voice of America were created to broadcast outside the United States. Movies also proved to be a huge area for propaganda. People of all ages would come to watch movies, and many anti-communist and anti-Soviet movies were put through theaters, and they were extremely biased. However, many movies such as James Bond are still enjoyed today. The propaganda in this period greatly matches our propaganda today, though it is not as nearly as extreme as it is in this period. During the Vietnam War, the free press played a large part in changing the types of propaganda Americans saw. The world was not only given the whitewashed version of war, seeing and hearing about only the actions of the enemy, but the actions of Allied troops as well. On the television news, the daily reporting of the death and destruction on both sides confused many of the American people. Most did not understand the atrocities of war and mistook some of the actions taken by the troops as acts of evil. In reality, they were simply acts of being involved in a war that always existed but were never shown in the past. Some believe allowing the lack of positive propaganda in the Americans' favor led to the public blaming of the troops for the participation in the war, rather than blaming the government who sent the troops there or the actions of the enemies that brought our troops to the war to begin with. This resulted in many of our troops returning home not with a hero's welcome as they should have been, but being greeted with protests and anger. In 1945, 2 years before the Cold War began, the Smith-Mundt Act was created, and in 1948 it was passed by Congress. This act had a stated purpose of combating the weapons of false propaganda and misinformation, preventing the understanding of American policies, preventing the freedom of information, and inhibiting the mutual understandings between American people and the people of other nations. The Smith-Mundt Act made a peacetime information activities like VOA permanent and was meant to expand cultural and education programs. However, it was also the requirement to tell the truth. Most times labeled as anti-propaganda today to protect Americans from our own government, this interpretation creates much confusion in the government in what can and cannot be said to whom, and it portrays U.S. government activities that inform and empower foreign policies as bad propaganda unfit for Americans. Currently, there has been an introduction of a modernized version of the Smith-Mundt Act this year. This led to many forms of propaganda still used today. With the free use of the internet and the immediate availability to the public of newscasts and videos, the government and other interested parties have the ability to plant any form of propaganda anonymously without providing the burden of proof and accuracy. Propaganda today has taken on many different forms, and while the Smith-Mundt Act prevented a great deal, much still thrives in America today. Most propaganda is shown through movies and television. However, you will also of course see it in newspapers, literature, and many other places, and still a lot of it is frequently military based. In media today, many movies are war-based films, movies like the Battleship and Transformers franchise. And quite frequently, our military will help out in these movies by lending out military equipment to increase the accuracy of these movies. And in return, they want to be able to proofread the movie to dispose of anything that would make the military look bad. This tactic is meant to show the positive points of the military to increase military support and recruitment. In addition to film and literature, the military also has a fairly large interest and influence on the gaming industry. The military today has a great influence on games today. Games like Medal of Honor and Call of Duty have both been made with extensive help from the military. The military is showing guns and how they work, and also many of the tactics you see in-game. In addition to what's in the game, the military has a great interest in games today because the military is beginning to build their technology around gaming so that soldiers are familiar with the tech. One example would be a Humvee that is mounted with a 50 caliber turret that is remotely controlled by an Xbox controller. And while many people may criticize the use of games to train soldiers, the method has proven to flourish and may continue for a long time. Propaganda was and still is a very important part of the United States military's tactics, especially during times of war. While the form and use of propaganda has changed over the years, its purpose has remained the same. It can be used to gain support from the people, demoralize the enemy, or hide the truth. But you, however, still have the freedom to choose what to believe.
Until the war is over and we're both a little older. Unknown soldier, grandchildren.